Hello everyone and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. Just a quick update to thank some new patrons who have subscribed to the podcast via patreon.com/the History Network. Ben Dearborn, thank you. Alastair Vincent, thank you. And Chris Larson, thank you. And thank you once again to all of our patrons who subscribe to the podcast through patreon.com/the History Network. If you don't yet subscribe, do go along to that URL. I'll just say it one more time, patreon.com/the History Network, and find out what we're all about there. So without further ado, the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 26, episode 8. No weapon could bite him. Part 2, King Arthur and his Knights. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray Darm is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Combat 40, Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior. Alexander confronts the Achaemenids, 334 to 331 BC, from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. Many magical items belong to the stories of Arthur and his knights, although their genesis is more complicated. Sir Percival had the shield of Joseph of Arimathea. Gawain had the shield of Judas Maccabeus. Galahad the shield of King Evalach, which had a cross drawn on it by Joseph of Arimathea in his own blood. The knights also had named swords and lances. These were all tied to a Christian tradition, and according to legend, the shields and weapons had been brought to Britain by Joseph of Arimathea, first keeper of the Grail, and the man who first brought Christianity to Britain and associated with Glastonbury Abbey. One of the most difficult figures to decipher and interpret in the Arthurian tradition is the Green Knight. For our purposes, across the 3 poems where he originally appears, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight from the 14th century, the Green Knight from around 1500, and King Arthur and King Cornwall from slightly later, he is sent to test the abilities and loyalties of Arthur's knights. In the Sir Gawain poem, he wears no armour, but is all green, including his hair and skin, and is protected from harm. But in the Green Knight, he has magical green armour. There are several figures upon whom the Green Knight could have been based, but importantly for us, there seem to be several historical figures who may have inspired or emulated him or the idea of him. The continuation of William of Tyre as a Green Knight, the Spaniard Sancho Martin, who led sorties from Tyre in 1197, and there are other green-clad knights in stories of Saladin, which all predate the Green Knight poems. This figure may have connections with the immortal Green Man al-Qadir figure from the Quran. Qadir literally means green one, sent to test and guide Moses and Alexander the Great, and so perhaps the figure was also sent to test Saladin, not to mention Arthur. Another possible source for the Green Knight is the motif of the Green Man, popular in medieval art. Even more recent examples may have inspired the Green Knight. In 1382, Amadeus of Savoy met Louis of Anjou on their way to contest the throne of Naples, dressed in green from head to toe, the colour of Savoy. But this included green saddles, bridles, breastplate and crupper, and surcoat. In the stories of Ragnar Lothbrok, who is the inspiration for the TV series Vikings, we find several explanations of his nickname, Hairy Breeches, as being related to a special armour which would protect him from a serpent or dragon's bite. He is associated with other magical items as well. Explanations of what this armour was vary, from frozen lamb's wool to boiled animal skin with the hair on the outside. It is interesting that some of these explanations take on a relatively mundane, practical and plausible explanation of their magical quality. Others maintain the magical quality. The Gesta Normanorum Ducum claims that Ragnar's magical shirt was a gift from his wife Auslag, and further that his daughters wove the magic raven banner. Although 5 sons are often named, only one other source, the Gesta Danorum, mentions daughters. In the Nibelungenlied, Siegfried famously bathed in the blood of a dragon to gain similar protection to that afforded to Ragnar. This hero slew a dragon and bathed in its blood, from which his skin grew horny, so that no weapon will bite it, as has been shown time and time again. Siegfried's magical armour is also linked to Achilles' magical protection, when he was dipped in the river Styx by his mother Thetis, holding him by the ankle and thus creating his literal Achilles' heel. Siegfried's weak point was where a leaf fell between his shoulder blades. The phrase that no weapon could bite him recalls similar phrases used of the Viking berserkir, who were also considered to have magical protection. The sagas are full of such men. They tend to prove mortal enough, but the terminology which surrounds them suggests that they and their enemies thought them magically protected. Their origins are disputed, and agreement cannot be reached on whether they are named after the idea that they were unarmoured or in shirt only, the meaning of berserk in Swedish. Others have them in a bearskin to distinguish them from the Ulfhednar, who wore wolfskins, and some consider these the same as berserkers. In Grettir's saga at the Battle of Harsford, the berserkers wore wolfskins. No iron could hurt them, and when they charged, nothing could withstand them. This, of course, does not delve into the animalistic battle rage aspect of the berserker, not to mention the belief that they could shapeshift into animal form. These topics are complex and deserve a fuller, independent treatment. Other figures from medieval warfare supposedly fought naked, such as the Irish, according to Gerald of Wales. In the Hevemal, Sayings of the High One, Odin has several spells where he can either blunt the blades, protect the skin, or cause several other afflictions to his enemies. Hevemal 148 speaks of a spell which fetters my enemy, the edges of my foes I can blunt, neither weapon nor club will bite for them. And 156, if I have to lead loyal friends into battle, under the shields I chant, and they journey inviolate, safely into battle, safely from the battle, safely they come everywhere. In the context of Siegfried and Ragnar, Hevemal 158 seems most pertinent. If I shall pour water over a young warrior, he will not fall though he goes into battle, before swords he will not sink. These spells come together with the berserker in the Ynglinga saga, where they are defined. Odin could make his enemies in battle blind, or deaf, or terror-struck, and their weapons so blunt that they could cut no more than a willow wand. On the other hand, his men rushed forward without armour, and were as mad as dogs or wolves, bit their shields, were as strong as bears or wild bulls, and killed people at a blow, but neither fire nor iron told upon themselves. This account has similarities to the report of the qualities of the Holy Lance and other similar items. Hevemal 158 is very like a Christian baptism. Christian prayers for the protection, strength, and the disabling of enemies' abilities are also remarkably similar. There is also the magical protection offered to the Berserker too, but what is surprising is the remarkable accounts we have of actual attempts at special armour in the Viking tradition. One thing to note is that they are all suggested as practical solutions to magic armour and are all cheaper alternatives to metal armour. The Jester Herwadi records that rebels in Zealand had felt cloaks impregnated with resin or pitch to make them impenetrable. Herward also had a famous sword which had done great deeds that he obtained in single combat. In Ragnar's saga, his clothes are made of animal hide with the hair on the outside, boiled in pitch and then rolled in sand. Saxo recounts that Ragnar begged from his nurse a woolen cloak and some very shaggy thigh coverings, with which he could subdue the serpent's bites. He dressed himself like this, believing that such clothing, cushioned with hair, would act as protection and at the same time be flexible enough to allow nimble movement. When his ship touched the Swedish coast, the weather was freezing. He intentionally threw himself into the waters, then exposed his soaking garments to be stiffened by the cold, so that they would become even less penetrable. The saga version would seem to have more practical effect, rationalizing the stories of myth. Achilles' armour in the Iliad was magically impenetrable because of the gold adorning, according to Homer. Gold, being the most malleable of metals, make this highly unlikely, but the tradition of rationalizing magical items had a long tradition. A Transylvanian folk tale of a dragon slayer has the hero don a lambskin coat and jump into an icy river so that the frozen wool would grant him protection, similar to Ragnar. These explanations might seem naive and unbelievable, but in 1977 John McPhee published an account of his travels in Alaska, coming into the country, New York, 1977. He recounted the story that male grizzly bears venturing out in winter would find a patch of open water in an otherwise frozen river, would wet their fur and then roll in the snow. The fur would thus acquire a thick ice plate. Arrows broke against the armouring ice, and it can be heavy enough to stop a bullet. This, according to McPhee, was the feared winter bear of the Eskimo, and this story seems to give credence to the saga version. We therefore see a plausible, practical armour, which could quite easily be interpreted or recorded as magical. Other examples of magical armour occur in the medieval period too. In the Persian epic, the Shahnameh, Esfandiar was given armour from heaven by the prophet Zoroaster, which made him invincible. He also bathed in a pool of invincibility, like Siegfried and Achilles, but Esfandiar's eyes were his vulnerable point, since he closed them when he immersed himself, and his eyes proved to be his Achilles' heel when he was killed by Rostam, who also had his share of magical equipment. The god Baldur was only vulnerable to a spear made of mistletoe thrown by the blind Hod after Loki's interference. In Saxo Grammaticus's historicised version of the same story in the Gesta Danorum, Balderus could not be harmed by steel, and he was eventually killed by a combination of poison, a bracelet of strength, and a belt which allowed Hertha to plunge a magic sword into Balderus's side. Hertha had also been given an impenetrable coat, and earlier he wore a sword-proof tunic. According to French historian Marion Melville, the Red Cross of the Knights Templar was intended to act as a shield. This Red Cross became associated with St. George, the warrior saint, who also wielded named weapons during the Second Crusade, although its genesis is complicated. The device is also associated with Genoa and Aragon. This protection is a rather literal interpretation of the idea expressed later in the 15th century by Thomas à Kempis in The Cross is Protection Against Our Enemies. But the idea of a symbol on a surcoat or shield which would protect the wearer is not that far removed from the magical shields and armour we have seen here. The ideas touched upon here are complex and tied inextricably to belief and myth, but there is enough history to show that tales of magical weapons and armour may very well have their origins in the weapons and armour of actual individuals involved in real events. Thanks for that two-parter, Murray. It was a cracker. If you'd like to have a go at writing a script for us, we are always welcoming your ideas. You can get in touch with either Angus or myself just by dropping a line to info@thehistorynetwork.org if you've got some suggestions for a script you'd like to write for us, or even if you'd not like to write the script yourself but have an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet and would like to see that covered, then do drop us a line. It's info@thehistorynetwork.org. Thanks once again to all our patrons. If you want to find more about that, just go to patreon.com/The History Network. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.